Okay, so settling into your meditation postures. I'm going to be grounding as much as we can, so taking a few moments just to arrive from whatever else we've been doing. And we're just going to move through a quick body scan. So becoming more aware of our physical sensations, what it's like to be in the body at this particular moment. And bringing our awareness to the crown, the scalp, working our way downwards, taking in the eyebrows, the muscles around the eyes, the whole face. Softening wherever we find tension, seeing if we can allow some restless energy to pass. Coming down into the neck and the shoulders. And doing the same there. Shoulders soften and descend, leaving the neck free. Flowing down the arms all the way into the hands. Then back to the chest and the upper back. Following the movements of the breath down into the belly, the abdomen. And the groin and the pelvis. And the way down into the legs. Big muscles of the thighs. Spaces of the knee joints. Calves and shins. And then the ankles and the feet. So coming back to broad awareness of the whole body. And whatever's coming up for us, whatever other thoughts are arising, we're not trying to push them away. We're not engaging with them either. Just noticing. Now in a moment, into this quiet space that we've created, just going to drop a series of words. And all I want you to do is notice what comes up. So what images or associations you might have. So there's no right or wrong answers. We're just noticing what our mind does in response. So the first word is matter. Matter. What do you see in your mind's eye when I say matter? Atom. Atom. What comes to mind in response to atom? And now body. Body. And mind. Mind. What comes in response to the word mind? And then the final word is reality. Reality. I'm going to gradually draw the meditation to a close now. In a moment I'm going to ring the bell again. And you can open your eyes and come back into the room whenever you're ready. Okay. So it's just a sort of a short meditative exercise, just to sort of allow us to arrive, but also just to get us to start sort of thinking about our responses to the kind of area that I'm going to be talking about tonight. We will do a bit more meditation later on, so that's not your only dose for the evening. It's just a sort of appetizer. So yeah, if we can just sort of talk about what came up. So yeah, what does anyone want to say what they saw? I'm sort of imagining it was visual, maybe it wasn't for you, but yeah, in response to any of those words, did you have a clear kind of picture?
I think for mind, that was probably the one where I had the biggest visualization. I think I saw like yourself in third person and the brain inside the head.
Yeah.
And then expanding out like interaction with almost reality, and then some reality later. Just that's how I visualized it, is myself and then going, because obviously it's interaction and all the stimuli that,
Yeah, great. Yeah, great. So for those of you who can't hear online, I might just repeat that. So there we had a sort of image of the brain, but then the brain sort of a view from sort of behind the head, but then the brain kind of interacting with the world around it as well. Anyone else at any of those? It could be matter, atoms, body.
You said body. At first I got a sense of sort of my own embodied awareness.
Yeah.
But then I had, it sounds a bit morbid when I say this, a dead body.
Yeah.
It didn't feel morbid, it felt more in the realm of the four sides.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, I was in this, probably because of the stuff that I'm doing today, but yeah, no, I thought body, I thought about, but then I saw again, not a morbid thought. The mind was just, I think, just immediately thought me. Yeah, less a visualization, more a sense of a place.
Yeah, so again, to repeat for those online, we've had, in response to body, two people sort of made the connection with dead bodies, and particularly probably because we were in a room full of Buddhists, that didn't seem like a particularly morbid thought. It was more just a certain awareness of mortality, and yeah, so that's fair. Yeah.
We have a couple of people online, Gareth.
Yeah, go ahead.
Mark.
Oh.
Right, yeah.
Sorry, bear with us with a moment. Something's just shattered on the tray. Wow.
No, the thing broke.
It's just here.
Goodness. Black, cracked, yeah. There's a bit that I think has gone underneath there, actually.
Yeah, really blow the other one out so we don't get.
I think that's happened before.
Is it when they burn very low?
Yeah.
Well, I think that was just that one crackling, but
Maybe something underneath this, I think it's gone.
yeah, okay.
But,
Oh, there.
see what I mean?
Yeah.
Possibly on this side as well. I don't want to blow it small. If it's smoldering, I'm just a bit concerned. So
Yeah.
plus we can pull it back and
That's fine.
I think it's okay.
Yeah, I can see it.
as long as it's not doing anything.
Okay. That was eventful. Wonderful. Wonders of the material world on display, chemistry happening behind me. Yeah. So, yeah, just before that, we were about to hear from a couple of people online. Is that right?
Yeah, Mark. Go, Mark.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
When you said body, I instantly thought our bodies are a vessel for our souls, which both are beautiful. That's what sprang to mind on that word.
Yeah, thank you.
Just thought I'd share that.
Yeah, thank you very much. Was there someone else online as well?
Rick, you want to read what you wrote?
Yeah, on the atom, I got an explosion in my mind, like a bright light.
Okay. Yeah.
And then that happened on there. It was that premonition, like, hello. So I went boom, and then I've got this bright light, so coincidence maybe.
Yeah, maybe.
Like an euphoria in your mind, boom. Yeah, sense of release, maybe. Yeah, that's what I thought. I was the atom.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, so quite sort of range of elements. What I'm going to ask, on a bit of a hunch, is So I'm gonna ask Ari Barchin if he could share the image A to start with. Just going to remove this sign here. So did anyone? So this is for atom. Did anyone see something like this? Yes. Yes, great. Yeah, of course.
The thing that I have with atom is I saw like an atom like that as we know it, and then I thought we are a bundle of atoms. Sort of thinking about atoms.
Oh, very interesting.
And the physics is like atoms trying to understand atoms. Is just like
Yeah.
That's the kind of thing that I like to do.
So we've just heard Lloyd was saying that a number of hands have gone up in the room, but Lloyd was also saying that he was sort of imagining that we're atoms, imagining atoms, and the sort of paradox of that.
I think one thing that for me, when you get to the end of talking about reality, is that actually all of those words kind of connect to each other and connect into reality, because they are all more than a thing. Matter is, for me, matter is an undescript mound of something. We're all made of matter. Our mind is more than the physical, biological lump of brain. Our body, we are more than our bodies.
Yeah.
Atoms make up everything, and reality is so individual. We have actually no way of going, what I think is my reality right now is yours, because it is so sort of nondescript and individual.
Yeah. So we've just heard there I'm going to paraphrase that. So something about all of the terms that we heard before, they all connect together, and yet there's also this sense that reality is very unique to all of us, and it has a subjective element as well as being material, which is really interesting.
Yeah, one thing that I thought was possibly a bit unhelpful to start with was I quite quickly found that my mind was trying to work out what was happening, what you were up to.
Yeah.
And but then I did notice that I know this is true, but there seems to be like a sequence from less real things to more real things.
That wasn't my intention, but that's valid. Does that make sense? Yeah, that's good. Yeah. I think I did have. I wonder what. Anyway, it's not important what I thought I was doing. In my head, there was just a sequence of words that are sort of in this area. I did deliberately put reality last. So I'm going to ask Arivachan to move on to image B and then C whenever you feel like it. So this, when I said mind, did anyone see either of these sort of things?
Yeah.
Sorry. Sorry.
Because you were the first thing I thought of since the word.
Yeah. Maybe I'll give them a moment.
I must admit, when you said natural, I got a little bit of the wrong end of it. I interpreted it as in what matters and what.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I realised that as I was saying it.
The first thing that came to my mind, and perhaps this is because of the shrining, was the Dharma.
Yeah.
Which is not, I think, what you were going for.
Not in this instance, although it's always that is one of the things that matter. So this is where we realise the resolution on the images I've chosen is not great. So this in response to mind, I picked out a couple that I thought might pop up for people. Any little bit? Yeah. Sure. And if you can bring up the other one whenever you're ready. So this sort of.
The next one is.
So this sort of this and the next one is sort of brain scan images. This kind of sort of quite very sort of. Well, it's the way I guess we're accustomed to seeing them represented in like.
Like a little bits lighting up and stuff.
Documentaries and like that's the kind of classic one. Yeah. And then we'll have the last image whenever you're ready, Arivachan. But there's some connections with one of those two? No, a couple of some shaking heads as well. Yeah. Well, it's interesting that the mind doesn't literally mean brain, and yet there's that association. Yeah. And then we got one final one, which was in. When I said matter, it's very small. Did anyone see anything like this? It's a sort of expanse of like molecules and yeah, me too.
It's strange I didn't have visuals of any of them. I don't know whether I think differently from other people. I just kept thinking of words associated with them.
Yeah,
so
sure.
Visualize.
That's interesting. I mean, that is a Yeah. Well, this is clearly revealing the different ways that we think, because I'm very much like that. As soon as you say the word, I just instantly have a mental picture. Yeah. So, thank you very much, Arivachan. You can bring me back now. So why have I shown you those, and why are we doing that? Well, partly the idea was to sort of well, I had a hunch that you're probably rather like me, and that we probably share a bank of images that we sort of imaginatively have in our heads about these things. And that in some of those cases, they even go a bit like they sort of, particularly that sort of brain-mind one. The mind isn't strictly the brain, and yet I can't think of one without thinking of the other. I have lots of arguments, and which you're going to hear some of later tonight, about how they're different, and yet the association is still there. So I just thought that would be an interesting thing. Partly I didn't know exactly what was going to happen, but just to see if that was the case. Like, do people recognize, or do we share these kind of associations? Are we kind of walking around with some of the same imagery in our minds, which I'm imagining we've probably picked up from school, from documentaries on the TV. I've got a couple of other examples of where it comes from as well later on, but yeah, sci-fi films, all sorts of places that we picked up from our culture, images of what things look like. The other thing I'll say now is that all of those images, with the exception perhaps of the third one, the brain scan, all of them are artists' impressions. So they're not what things literally look like. In terms of atoms don't literally look like anything. You sort of see them in electron microscopes, but the images that have been produced they're useful. They're for us to sort of understand a bit better what's happening. But that's not literally what's going on. And yet I don't know if I can say honestly to myself that I am aware of that when I'm thinking. I just kind of assume that that's what's really happening. So we'll come back to all of that a bit later, but having put you through all that, I'll now explain what I'm talking about tonight. So this evening, sort of following on from it's part of the Nature of Mind season that we're doing. And this is me following on from the interview with Bernardo Kastrup that went out a couple of weeks ago. Has anyone watched it? Began it? Yeah, it's fine. It's not a test. It's not. And there was a seminar, a sort of discussion thing in connection to it that came out last week as well. Bernardo Kastrup is an analytical idealist. So he's a philosopher. He used to be a computer scientist and a physicist, I believe. He worked at CERN, and sort of out of that work, he came to this where he sort of realized that there were issues with materialism, which is the subject of tonight's sort of discussion. And then sort of following that train of thought, he kind of came to the view that actually what made most sense was to think that the ultimate sort of nature reality is mental, and that everything else is sort of secondary or contained within that. So actually, I'm not going to be talking that much about idealism tonight or about Bernardo Kastrup. The aim for this evening is just to look at what materialism is, and then also why it might be a problem, and the ways we might sort of expand our view beyond that. So one thing just to state is that I'm talking about materialism in the sort of philosophical sense, rather than in terms of valuing objects more than spiritual life, although they are connected, I would argue. I'm going to be assuming that you are like me in that you've lived with materialism sort of in the background all of your life. It's basically the ground of your thinking. You may have other thoughts alongside it which don't work which don't line up with it completely. Probably have feelings about what happens after death that maybe don't line up with that. but that's there as well, and it's powerful, like the sort of view that what is most real is matter. So what I'm not going to be doing is I'm not attempting to discredit science. You don't need to be a materialist in order to value science. In fact, Bernardo Castro sort of obviously comes from that background, still sees scientific work as very valuable, but you don't. But you don't need to. I'll maybe say a bit more about how you can do those things. I'm also not arguing for his particular sort of view of things about idealism. And I'm also not particularly going to discuss phenomena that don't fit easily into our current worldview. There's quite a bit of that as part of the Nature of Mind season. We may hear about more of it later, in terms of there's lots of phenomena that actually are fairly well documented, which materialism can't explain very adequately. So things like near-death experiences, there's sort of instances where people, young children, have memories of a previous life, which there's no clear explanation of how they could have that information. That sort of stuff doesn't quite fit into the sort of materialist worldview. But I'm not actually going to be talking about any of that tonight. So whatever you feel about it it's not on the table tonight. So what is materialism? So the OED, God bless the OED, I found out tonight that if you have a library card, you have access to the Oxford English Dictionary. I'd forgotten about that. It's great. You just put your library card number in the website. So the Oxford English Dictionary defines materialism as the theory or belief that nothing exists except matter and its movements or modifications. More narrowly, the theory or belief that mental phenomena are nothing more or are wholly caused by the operation of material or physical agencies. So there's something sort of related to that, which sometimes gets talked about as reductive physicalism, the idea that everything is reducible to what's physical, material processes. So there's a few nodding heads in the room, so it's probably making some connection with us. One thing I was going to say is some of this stuff can seem quite abstract and sort of philosophy-y, but I think it does influence all of us, whether we formulated it and reflected on it or whether we consciously hold it as a view or not. Just because it's sort of the background assumption for most of our culture. And I think that line in the definition about a theory or a belief sort of brings that out, that yes, you can theorize about it quite deliberately and come up with arguments for why materialism is correct. Most of us, even if we haven't done that, have it as part of our sort of, our sort of standard kind of views that we just kind of absorb, as I sort of mentioned a bit earlier. So just to sort of maybe explain that again. So what's meant by mental in a way is particularly what's at stake is our subjective experience. So what it feels like to be a person. So there's this idea of qualia. Qualia is the philosophical term for the feeling of what it is to have an experience. So there's a classic kind of thought experiment about a woman who is, she's put in a room and everything she has access to is black and white. And she's taught about the nature of color perception. She becomes an absolute master of it, of the field. And one day she's let out of the room and experiences color for the first time. So qualia is the thing that she gains the experience of for the first time, in a way. Like, you might know everything there is conceptually to know about a subject, but when you have that first direct experience of it, there's something in that which isn't reducible to data, basically. It's sort of, so in a way you can devise very elaborate systems which might have, you could sort of program a robot to have, this is kind of classic sci-fi territory, you program the perfect robot and it behaves exactly as a human does, but does it feel, is it actually alive? So that's the materialist worldview, sort of view says that actually the only thing that's really real and important, all of that sort of subjective stuff is reducible to the matter. That's the important stuff. That causes everything. The rest of it is sometimes talked about as this sort of epiphenomena, a sort of a phenomena that doesn't really influence anything. It's just kind of, it's this balloon kind of bumbling around whilst the actual work gets done lower down. That's not a great image, but you sort of get the idea that in a way, because the fact that we feel that things feel a certain way doesn't necessarily change the way we behave. I mean, I think it does actually, but you could imagine a mechanism or an animal having a behavior without it feeling anything in particular, means that in a way you don't need that quality experience in order for the world to kind of make sense. So you can kind of put it in brackets and forget about it. And that's kind of what materialism does. Is that making any sense? Is this making sense to people? Yeah, I may have made it worse as I went along. So one thing just to say, I'm running slightly behind. So one thing just to say at this point is that materialism is not proven. It is just. I mean, there's quite a lot of philosophical debate about it, and a lot of it's quite robust, but it's not by any means like proven. And I'm not saying that in the way that, all science is just a theory. I mean, like, there's genuine, deep philosophical issues with it that have never been resolved, and some people argue that they never will be. So this kind of mind-body problem, like, how is it that we can be that we can have these bodies which clearly made out of matter, what we understand as matter, and yet we have this subjective experience? How do those two things fit together? And the sort of a lot of materialist sort of the conversation around that sort of implies that eventually we will understand that as long as we keep learning more about how the brain works, at some point we will be able to explain that. But that's not necessarily the case, which isn't to say that that what we learn from neuroscience isn't valid or interesting. But in a way, what you're seeing there is a sort of association between parts of the brain and how they function, and a subjective experience. But what doesn't become clear, no matter how much detail you get about that, is why, when you get so many neurons together, suddenly you have, I don't know, the taste of oranges on a spring morning, and like melancholy and like all of that stuff. Like, you might be able to say how that works, but not why it should be possible at all, like, if that makes sense. This is sort of the thing that sent Kastrup down his sort of his path, is that he was designing very complex artificial intelligences for the CERN project, and he sort of realized that there was nothing that he could add that would shift it from being just a machine to being to being alive. It could become more and more complex and more sophisticated, but it wasn't clear what. There's nothing that you can say, oh, once it's got this, then it will have a feeling, and it will be a thing. It will be a living thing in the way that we are. So this is sometimes talked about as the hard problem of consciousness, because there seems to be this just intractable gulf between seeing something as an object, as a bundle of matter, and something which is subjective, which, you know, we feel from inside. It's there's even oh no, I'll come to that another time. I realise I'm going to refer to that later. You'll hear about it later. So there is actually some grounds for disputing the kind of connection between the sort of causal idea that the brain produces consciousness. There are other ways that you could describe that process that makes sense. It might be more that the brain is a kind of sort of receiver, or sort of modulates something which is already there. This is something that has been talked about in a couple of the other nature of mind sort of talks that have been part of this series. But let's just assume that it does. Let's just take for granted that one of the premises of materialism, that there is this unbreakable connection between the brain and the mind. There's a necessary connection between those two things. So I'm going to argue briefly here that even if you take that as read, that doesn't necessarily lead you to materialism. Well, in the previous definition I gave you, the Oxford English Dictionary, it mentions, so materialism is a theory or belief that mental phenomena are nothing more or are wholly caused by the operation of material or physical agencies. So what does it mean for something to be wholly caused by, to be sort of created by? And I think there's something odd about that, actually. So the implication there is that you have matter, and then it's as if consciousness arrives sort of later, that you get the conditions for it, and then consciousness comes in. And in a way that makes sense. But actually, I think if you, particularly from a Buddhist perspective, it doesn't quite. So if the connection is necessary, then it must be sort of inevitable. Like, it's the moment there is the conditions for it, consciousness is there. In fact, they're more like two aspects of the same flow of conditions, rather than you have matter and then you add on the consciousness. So I think there's a real sort of connection there with the idea of co-arising, dependent in origination. Sometimes you get this notion that in Buddhism, rather than the things being arising in a sort of linear way, like a bit like a row of dominoes falling, what you get is something more like simultaneous, interdependent arising of two things which sort of need each other. They sort of lean on each other. I think that's one thing that sort of Buddhism has to offer to this kind of debate that might be helpful for dealing with that discrepancy. And the consequences of seeing it in that way are that, they just become two aspects of the flow of phenomena. So you don't need to say that the implication that mind isn't real and that your subjective experience is not actually valid, or is less valid than the brain scan, kind of goes away. They're just, without having to throw anything out either. So what I was going to mention earlier was Mysterianism, which is, who's that from? Mysterianism, it's Colin Ginn, he's another philosopher. So he came up with this idea that the mind-body problem that we talked about earlier is intractable because of the way our minds work. So we have capacity to perceive objectively. We can sort of see the world around us, and we have a capacity to reflect and to introspect and to examine our own subjective experience. And because they're two totally different and unrelated modes of perception, it means that we have the experience that there is matter, this kind of objective stuff, and then there's us. He says that it's not because we're stupid or because we're not trying hard enough, but because there's this deep kind of split in our experience of ourselves and the world, that we have this philosophical problem which we can't resolve. And that sort of puts me in mind also of like what Bhante says sometimes about what Sangha talks about is that all of experience has these two poles of subjective and objective experience. So there's the part of it which feels more like us, and there's the part of the whole perceptual situation which feels more like it's out there. And the sort of ratio of those poles differs depending on whether you're having a meditative experience or whether you're picking up a coffee cup, but there's usually this kind of polarity. Yeah, and yet we could still see those poles as connected and dependent on each other, rather than one dominating the other. So that's the first of my sort of suggestions of ways that we could break that down. And you'll be relieved to know that's the slightly harder one to communicate. But what I want to take us, as we come up to the tea break, what I want us to come out of that first half with is the sense that for us, just as human beings, we that sort of premise of materialism is a bit strange, really, that what you have is this emphasis that what's subjective is not is sort of less valid or less real, and that given that the premise is not like absolutely nailed down, it hasn't been completely proven, that it's sort of a value statement at this point. Yeah, it's understandable. I'm going to talk about why it's understandable and what kind of supports it in the second half. But yeah, but particularly for us as practitioners, it's so important that we value, just our own subjective sense of being a person, the quality of our experience, and prize that as much as the information that we might get from a brain scan or something like that. So that is the first half. So we got 15 minutes of tea break. So we'll come back actually let's say if we come back at 8:35, so a little bit less than 15 minutes. Okay.
All right. Before we go to the tea break, we have the Dana appeal now.
I was going to put the Dana appeal later, but yeah, we can do it now.
No, whatever you prefer. Just checking.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I was going to say announcements when we come back.
Yeah, and Dana appeal at the same time.
Dana appeal at the end.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, great. Vachin. Okay, so welcome back, and welcome back to everyone online. So in the first half, we were hearing about what materialism is. I was also sort of explaining that it hasn't been verified. It is a sort of a view at this point. And I was also sort of arguing that it devalues one sort of aspect, one whole sort of aspect of conditioned phenomena, which is the sort of our subjective experience. So this, so then how has it sort of come to be so widespread, and what does it sort of do for us as a view? So in some ways there is something very compelling about, and in a way that connection between the brain and the mind is it is quite compelling. So obviously there's things like brain injury, degenerative brain conditions, the influence of drugs, and just sort of chemistry, brain chemistry on our subjective experience. All of this is really well documented, has been increasingly for centuries. There was a very famous example of a man who who had a sort of whose whole personality changed after a serious head injury, which sort of damaged part of his brain. So in a way, that connection between what seems to be a mental phenomena, personality, and the brain, sort of, in a way, it's quite clear and quite well documented. What I would say is that that also somewhat, in a way, it's much easier to document that direction of causality than the other way. But some of it is quite common sense as well. So if you were experiencing stress, grief, loss, in some ways those are all subjective experiences. They're all dependent on us having a sort of subjectivity, and yet they have direct physical consequences. That's one way in which materialism sort of ignores some aspects of what's happening that aren't helpful. Now, you might say in response to that if we had more detailed information about what was going on in the brain, we'd still be able to explain that, which is sort of fair enough. However, I think it still somehow ignores what we were talking about before, this sense that that subjective element, there's no reason to throw that out just because we have very detailed connections between the two. It's still there, and it's not sort of some optional extra that's added on. It's a necessary part of the universe, basically. And yet this sort of, that medical evidence, it sort of fits with the kind of society that we're in. Of course we value it. I mean, not only does it have like practical effects, like it, particularly sort of what we've learned about brain chemistry and the effects that has on our consciousness has led to all sorts of medicines. In some ways, that's another talk, like the effect that a lot of sort of this is fairly well sort of known thing, that a lot of the ways that we categorize mental illness are actually determined by the medicines that we have and what they're effective on. Which is a bit perverse, actually, and has some pretty negative consequences. But without getting into that, that is just kind of a bit of a fact, really, that the effectiveness of those is of chemistry on our minds has sort of changed how we understand what our minds are. And the sort of effectiveness of things, in a way, it's sort of natural to privilege a brain scan when you know that it might lead to surgery that might save your life, and to sort of give that authority. And in a way, I'm not arguing that those things aren't valuable or aren't effective, but there's then this sort of leap that we make, where we then start to downplay or in a way invalidate what is just present for us, which is this feeling of being alive, in favor of that stuff which seems more real, more authentic, more valid. When I don't think we need to do that. We don't need to make that choice. And there's something a bit more broad than that, where we live in a highly mechanized industrial society, and that mode of thinking, beyond any particular evidence or connection that we've found between the presence of one chemical in the brain and one subjective experience, is just a kind of way of thinking that makes sense to us. It's mechanisms, structures, electrical impulses. That stuff is very powerful. We experience the consequences all the time. If someone talks in that language, it resonates with us, and we're more inclined to believe it. So in a way, I would say, particularly for those of us who aren't scientists, me, it's as though we have a kind of mythology, like a sort of shared imaginative language. This is where the exercise at the beginning comes in, which we give credence to, which we accept, which has kind of value. I'm going to ask Arivachan to play a YouTube video now, which will sort of illustrate a bit of this sort of, yeah, sort of this tendency to sort of, or this sort of language that we have, this almost mythology, I'm going to argue, has a lot of authority, and sometimes people can appeal to that in ways which are manipulative, and we'll see.
Hydration is the foundation of healthy skin, but environmental factors such as lack of sleep and stress causes the surface skin cells to become cracked and open, which allows for excessive moisture to escape through the epidermis. The skin barrier loses elasticity, flexibility, and cohesion. All of this can cause your skin to form dry lines and become flaky, cracked, uneven, or dull. Introducing Neutrogena Hydro Boost, a breakthrough innovation from Asia that instantly quenches skin and hydrates skin in 2 ways. How does it work? First, Neutrogena Hydro Boost replenishes skin with a pure boost of hydration. It contains hyaluronic acid, naturally found in the skin, which acts like a sponge and can hold up to 1,000 times its own weight in water. The formula then creates a reservoir, which continuously releases hydration into the skin cells, keeping the skin plump and hydrated. Next, Neutrogena Hydro Boost strengthens the skin's moisture barrier using glycerin and olive extract, and helps prevent excessive moisture loss, leaving the skin feeling soft and smooth. This unique water gel formula allows Neutrogena Hydro Boost to deliver hydration on demand, when and where your skin needs it. The result is hydrated, supple skin that glows from within.
Thank you very much. So I probably don't need to say much more than that, but it's kind of there's been so many jokes about that kind of thing of like the appeal to science to kind of dress up with some cosmetics. I'm sure it's a very good skin cream, but like there is something quite sort. I'm not hoping that would be good if we just sort of wheeled some out at the end. But you can see there some of the same imagery, it's with a slightly bizarre way that the skin's being presented, which I'm not exactly sure it's like this network of tiles, which is sort of abstract representation of dry skin, but then it's also sort of implying that that's like a picture of the molecules when the water comes down, and it's sort of, it's nonsense, but it's scientifically nonsense, which sort of feels more compelling than, I don't know what I can't imagine what the equivalent would have been with a different period, I don't know, so appeal to the gods maybe, like it's been blessed by, name your deity, Zeus or something like that. And I think there is an appeal, not just in things like that, but in other areas of our life, in fiction as well, like to this sort of subatomic as a sort of magical realm, where the normal rules don't apply, and immense power is available if you know how to manipulate things correctly. I was even thinking of has anyone seen Ant-Man? That's literally what happens in that film, like the subatomic world is sort of a place of magic. In a quite a humanized sort of way. There's quite a lot to be said about that. But I guess the point is that just to get across the fact that, or this sense that materialism as a view that those of us, we're just kind of walking around with, it's all bound up with that stuff, how we respond to images, what we take seriously, what we don't. It sort of presents as solid and definite things which are much more mysterious and more abstract. And that's often, I mean, in a case like that, we're being manipulated, basically. It's not always, there's lots of people who hold and would support materialism in a very good faith way because they think that's the truth. But as a kind of, when we hold it as an assumption, it does, which isn't examined, it can be manipulated. And I think we sort of know this, and that's why there's been a bit of I was almost hesitant to talk about this stuff because I'm aware that there's a kind of backlash against experts. And I think it actually comes from this, that there's sort of awareness that we're open to being. We do place value on science, on this kind of language, and yet we don't know enough about it, or don't have the time, even if we do, to verify things ourselves. And we know that we're sometimes being manipulated by that. So it leads to suspicion. I don't have any solutions to that, unfortunately, but just to sort of just to say that I think that's part of where it comes from. So I'm going to throw another idea at you, which is the idea of naive realism, sometimes called direct realism. So this is the idea that for a lot of the time we're sort of just treating our senses as if they were a window onto the world as it actually is. So I see a cup, that's it. It's as simple as that. And science in some ways complicates that, because it makes us aware of all the mechanisms that are going on in our brains that make that possible. It also tells us that the properties of the cup, when we investigate it in a certain way, are not quite as they seem. You get really deep down into it. What seems to be solid is like a play of waves of probability and all sorts of things when you get down into the sort of quantum level. So it sort of complicates things on that level, and in a way that's sort of good. However, I would say that we can come to that more critical appraisal of the world. We can sort of take apart a naive acceptance that we just have a direct access to things as they are. As Buddhists, from reflection, we're sort of all doing that in a way. It's like becoming aware of what we're perceiving, not taking that immediately for granted, that, I don't like this person, therefore they're a bad person. Even on that level, you're sort of reflecting on, there's a whole process going on inside me that creates that impression. So some of what, I think sometimes we look to materialism to give us access to that truth, which is a bit deeper than our common sense, reactive kind of way of dealing with the world. But it's not a great solution, and I think reflection is better, or a good accompaniment for that, certainly when it comes to our actual day-to-day experience. So we can challenge assumptions through introspection as well as through observation that we associate with science. I'm aware that that's kind of an aside, actually, but I'll move on. So why bother? Why is it important whether you're a materialist or not? I think I've sort of probably brought out a little bit of it here and there, but just to sort of state it again, that if we hold to the view that the only thing that is really real is matter, is sort of this kind of image that some of us have of like a kind of billiard balls kind of bouncing around underneath the sort of illusion of life that we have. If that's the only thing that's real, it makes it seem that, number one, your day-to-day experience is meaningless and is wrong and is just in your head, and that you are basically alone. You used to live in a sort of desert of meaningless indifference, briefly illuminated by pleasure. And you don't need to believe that. Actually, that we sort of behave as if we have no choice, as if that's just the hard facts. That's just what we've got to live with. But that's not really the case. As I've been trying to sort of pull out, there's a lot of assumptions in there. It's very one of the very really interesting things that came out of the talk with Bernardo Kastrup is where he's talking about what does materialism do for us? Why believe that? What's useful about it? Partly, some quite interesting sort of history of ideas. Obviously, it's not an idea that's always been around. It's got a relatively short history in terms of how long humans have been around. but he was sort of talking about it in terms of, opens up a space which is away from the church, where science could sort of work and not be persecuted, which is fascinating. But it also, it does take away some things that we would want to be rid of, which is fear of the afterlife, worry about what happens to us when we die, which has been an overriding preoccupation for humans probably as long as we've been alive. And the idea that, and I wonder if a lot of us can perhaps identify with this. Again, this might be quite personal, but sometimes it's a relief to think that it is all in your head, that actually the problems that seem so overwhelming to you are in a way not real, like underneath. Sometimes that desert that I evoked seems like a kind of cool like body of water that you can just slip into, and like to take the heat of like dukkha off, basically. That it's hard being a human, and sometimes it's easier to think that that struggle to keep going, to stay alive, is sort of you could just shrug it off and just not exist. Buddhism talks about this, that there is, as well as the desire to exist, there's also the desire to not exist, because it's a relief sometimes when things are difficult to want that. And I think materialism meets that need in us, as well as taking away the fear of the afterlife. But just to sort of stay with that image of things being all in our heads, I think there's two really obvious objections to that. I mean, obviously it's not a scientific statement. But it's the way we talk. And in a way, I think that's kind of what I've been trying to address. Is like not so much the way this stuff kind of hits us a bit under the waterline, like in our emotions. So it's all in our heads. Well, one objection to that is it's not only our head. Like there's quite a lot of heads around, and the other aspect of that is it sort of implies that your head is not part of the world, which is not the case, unfortunately. It's very much part of the world. Everything that happens in it happens in the world. And regardless of how consciousness comes about, what processes lead to it or lead to its cessation, it is part of the fabric of things. And I see no reason not to see it as another property of the universe, really. When the conditions are right, this is what happens. This what's happening in your minds now is what happens. We don't need to dissolve that down a level in order to reach some security. You can sort of take it as it is. Obviously, we can get into problems when we sort of add things onto our experience, but that's what the path is here to help us not to do, is to sort of, to meet the experience as it is, which is what we're going to be ending with. So I'm going to move into a period of the Metta Bhavana. But before that, I mean, if anyone does have any questions, I didn't plan this, but it's fine if you have any questions before we come. This is going to be the beginning of the end of the evening. Yes.
There's one bit about what you say about the craving for non-existence.
Yeah.
Were you saying that people would chase after materialism as a way of finding a relief because they're going to die and that's it as far as materialistic things are concerned? That's a good thing and a relief.
Yes, I think basically, in a way, it's easier not to think that. If things are difficult for you, and and the prospect of it continuing seems like worrying, then it's easier to think about it just coming to an end. And even that actually it's not real anyway. It's sort of, I guess that's the other layer of it, that not only is it going to end, but it's just in your head. Like and that it's going to be gone soon anyway. So there's kind of like, yeah, yeah. Obviously, that's a rather oblique way out of. It's not a, but if you're in a difficult enough state, it can seem like a relief.
Yes, I always like to think of the opposite of that, is that you and your experience as well, that can have such an impact on others' experience. So, for example, you're not to be here anymore, or you, so, those that affects, like you said, with grief and your existence, just have sort of a massive impact on other people's long-term, short-term.
Yeah, absolutely. And I imagine, again, that's something that we get glimpses of in practice, is you change the way you behave, and then not only does that alter your life, but then all the people around you. And then, that's another kind of ground for, picking apart that kind of assumption that what's happening in our minds is not real, because you can see.
A lot of your talk, I just kept thinking of like the Truman Show. It's so subjective sometimes that you feel that yours is the only experience sometimes that's going on, because it's all from your own.
Yeah. I mean, that's probably another good thing to bring out. This was an interesting part of the Bernardo Kastrup talk, is that on the one hand, there's materialism, which has got a relatively brief history and sort of reinforces this sense that we're isolated. And yet there's another quite much deeper level, which is probably just born into us as human beings, where we identify an inside and an outside. There's us and there's not us. And that's not a culturally constructed thing. I mean, a culture will influence how we understand those concepts. But we just kind of feel that way. It's short of enlightenment, you probably can't, or I don't know, particular extreme experiences, you can't quite get away from that. It's just with us all the time. So that feeling of like being isolated and separate, we sort of have a tendency towards that anyway. And then something like this comes along and it sort of reconfirms that. So that's probably another reason why it feels so compelling, is because we already feel like we're separate.
Did you say that what the kind of official Buddhist position, or whatever that might mean, but would it be in agreement with Bernardo's position then, in terms of, because I think, and that's a follow-up question, do you think you can be a materialist and Buddhist?
Those are interesting questions. I'm aware that you may not be able to hear this online. So that last question was, does Buddhism line up with Bernardo Kastrup and idealism, or could you be a materialist and a Buddhist? There's probably lots of answers to that. I think because we probably are Buddhists dealing with believing in materialism, so I wouldn't say no. That would be awkward for me. But I think it makes it harder to practice. That's something they said in the seminar, this one that's last week, is that in some ways it might be harder to be a Buddhist now than any other time, because we have this sense that our minds are less real than this other slightly abstracted source of authenticity, which makes it harder to take your practice seriously, and harder to take your mind seriously and its consequences in the world. It makes it harder to make that deeper shift from feeling alone and separate to feeling connected, which is one way of understanding what we're aiming at. I don't think you necessarily need. There's some really interesting ways that Buddhism fits with what Bernardo Kastrup's talking about, but it's not exactly one-to-one either. I mean, traditionally Buddhism doesn't really have this matter-mind distinction, so it's sort of it's a bit apples and oranges. There's some stuff that maps on, but that's not a concept that the Buddha was working with, really. Not exactly anyway. Not exactly in the way we think of it.
Yeah.
I think that's probably true. Anyway.
One last question. Well, I say one last question. Possibly, let's see how people may have other ideas. So this happens to line up with some of the subjects I'm interested in, and some of the subjects that, dare I say, I like to play armchair philosopher with.
Sure.
So with that in mind, I would like to know more. What are some of the sort of alternative theories, if you like, that kind of maybe not oppose materialism, but that offer a different point of view to materialism? What are some kind of other ones in this space that I can go and look up?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, a good place it would be good to go through that, the talk with Nina Kastrup and the seminar. I mean, it's quite a broad area, but I mean, idealism is like the opposite tendency, which he's one version of. So that's probably a good place to start. And there's a whole gradation of different ways of understanding the relationship between mind and matter and how soluble that is. I've given you a little bit of an overview of some of it, but there's quite a lot more to dig into. I did one thing. If you want a really good, brief, bite-size dip into it, there's a crash course philosophy video that's good way to. It's a good 7 minutes. But yeah, you hear a bit more about some of the stuff I mentioned. So that's I think it's, can't remember what the title of it is, but it's something about the mind body. If you crash course philosophy, mind body.
No, a good YouTube video. It's basically
yeah, they're very good.
That, which will kind of summarise it in a really
and that'll give you some ways in.
Yeah, thank you.
Unless there's anyone online, we'll move on to meditation and wrapping things up then. No? Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, so if you want to settle into your meditation postures. So, closing your eyes. So just coming back into that more direct experience of the body that we had before. Just beginning to wish ourselves well. I'm going to encourage you to approach that from the perspective of awareness today. just as we've been taking in our bodies. The mind has many other things in it. Sound, smell, taste, touch. These are all the things that we are thinking of. Memories, images, all sorts of chains of association. Thoughts about the past and the future. Thoughts about who we are and what the world is like. Our mind mediates everything that we can experience. And through it all is the desire to be happy, the desire to avoid suffering, and the desire to grow and to be free. Whatever it is that we are, and wherever we've come from, may we be happy. Experiences are preceded by mind, led by mind, and produced by mind. If one speaks or acts with an impure mind, suffering follows, even as the cartwheel follows the hoof of the ox. Experiences are preceded by mind, led by mind, and produced by mind. If one speaks or acts with a pure mind, happiness follows, like a shadow that never departs. If you find that you've become distracted, just noticing whatever it is that's appeared in your mind and coming back to the body. Back to an awareness of the whole sphere of our experience. And then becoming aware of all the other minds in the room or watching online. May we all be happy. May we all be well. May we all be free from suffering. Gradually drawing the meditation to a close. In a moment I'm going to ring the bell again. Whenever you're ready, you can open your eyes. Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, so please join us again next week for Parivachin. Oh, sorry, can you? Yeah, I was just about to hand over to Anthony, who'll be finishing us with the Dharma appeal.
Thanks for great.